All right. Good morning, everyone. Grateful to have you here today to talk a little bit more about the resettlement landscape. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you have questions that come along, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know colleagues here will queue for me. I won't be able to see them. Will queue for me. Really want this time to be able to be useful for you. So if you have questions that come up, I'll try to answer them as we go along. My name is Rachele King, and I lead the Resettlement Programs Office at the Minnesota Department of Human Services, where I serve as State Refugee Coordinator. And happy to be here to talk a little bit about the Minnesota resettlement landscape because there's lots of conversation happening about this in our community. Lots of terms floating around about people who are newcomers in our community, the terms refugee, the terms humanitarian parole, immigrant, all of these terms swirling around in our public and private dialogue. And while sometimes information that I hear swirling is accurate, sometimes it's not quite accurate, and sometimes it's just wrong. So one of the goals of our office in the Resettlement Programs Office is to be a source of reliable information. And so the goal of this presentation today is to provide some reliable information about the federal structures for granting humanitarian protection status and the current trends that we're seeing in Minnesota. So really appreciate you being curious and taking time to seek additional information and learn more about this topic. So I don't know, I think the words disappeared on here. So I'm gonna skip this one. What I thought was on this slide was information from the U.S. Department of State website and about Minnesota, about why it's important, why providing humanitarian protection is important. Generations of immigrants from every corner of the globe have enriched the unique character of our state through their contributions to our economy, our culture, and our communities. And Minnesota recognizes the important contributions immigrants make to revitalize and enrich our communities and celebrates the cultural diversity that makes the state a great place to live. Some focused topics today. We're going to talk a little bit about the federal pathways to humanitarian protection. We could talk for months on all of these topics, but for the purpose of this 45 minutes today, we're going to do a really high level overview on these four areas. I really hope by the time that we're done today, you'll have a better understanding about the main protection pathways that are bringing people to Minnesota right now, have a good idea of the arrival trends that we're seeing here, and be able to identify resources that are available to people who have a humanitarian protection status in Minnesota and where to learn more. Also at the end, really want to share more information about economic impact of resettlement programs, both nationally and in our state. So with that, I'm going to start talking about some federal pathways to humanitarian protection at the very highest level. But before that, I wanted to really talk about what leads people to seek or secure a humanitarian protection status. People deserve to live in safety, and today and throughout our history, people have had to leave their homes to find safety due to situations that are outside of their control. Nobody plans on having to make that terrible choice or take that action to leave their home. And I put these pictures up because these pictures span history and geography. They include people fleeing fascism after World War II, people fleeing countries in Asia and Africa, such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Liberia. And they include more recent images of people fleeing Syria. So that upper right-hand corner picture is an image that we saw in the media quite a lot. And then the bottom right-hand corner is Afghan evacuation. Bottom left-hand corner is from people fleeing Ukraine. So again, spans geography and it spans our time and our history. And while these images change over time, the common thread that bring people here is the running for their lives. In these situations, the US government has offered protection to some people who are displaced. And we know that even if the experience of a person before coming to the United States is similar, depending on how they arrive to the United States, what pathway they get here through, they might be given different immigration classifications. And that does define what their rights and responsibilities are in the United States, and as well as what types of help they might be eligible for. So while, again, the situation that brought them here might be the same. The status that they enter with makes a big difference in what their experience is like here in the United States. And that's nothing new for us here in Minnesota. Minnesota is proud to be a welcoming state. Throughout our history, we've welcomed people seeking safety who are represented in all of these pictures. And we know that the investments in providing welcome have yielded really long-term benefits for our state. So we'll talk a little bit about the different pathways today. And just to bring it into like the global context, this is some statistics from the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. There are over 108 million people who are forcibly displaced worldwide. And when you look at the numbers, there's only globally less than 0.5% are provided an opportunity to resettle anywhere in the world in a given year. And so humanitarian protection pathways, again, before I get to the specific pathways, just to understand some of the constructs that impact people in our structures in our federal and state systems. There's three really distinct components to think about, and they are federally funded. You'll see on the left-hand side are parts of the program and process that are overseen by the U.S. Department of State, federal processes. So determining eligibility are overseen by the federal government. So processing applications, reviewing eligibility, completing background checks, that all happens, and deciding who is authorized to enter the United States. Those are all federal processes and decisions. The suitcase icon that you see in the middle is reception and placement. This is also overseen by the federal government and the Department of State in cooperation with community organizations. In this part, it's a federal government working with those community-based organizations that determine where are people going to go, who's going to meet people or welcome people when they arrive, and connect them to resources that are available. In Minnesota, the way historically how people have typically gained a humanitarian protection status has been through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, where we have six now local resettlement affiliates around the state that have contracts, federal contracts to provide that reception and placement. As we'll discuss a little bit later, there have been new and emerging pathways that have brought people here in ways in addition to that U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And then on the far right, though, is really where my office at the state of Minnesota and Department of Human Services come in. That's about, we don't determine who comes, how many people come, where they're going to live. It is our role and responsibility that once people are here to help make sure that they're able to build well-being in our state and contribute to our communities. Our office is mostly federally funded through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that does provide resources to states to help people during their first 5 years to establish that well-being and build self-sufficiency. So I'm going to get to those pathways, but I think I always want to start thinking about people. We're going to talk a lot about process and we're going to talk about status, but really want to ground ourselves in that we're talking about the experience of people. The numbers that I talk about, the statuses are tied to people. And so just really think about like one minute or 1 second to just really think about what are the things that are really important and define who you are. Feel free to put them in the chat so others can see them, or just think about them to yourself. I can't see the chat, but I think you guys can, so feel free to share those. In doing this exercise in lots of different places, a lot of things that we hear people talk about being really fundamental to who they are is people's homes, their families, their education, profession. And if you could safely live with your family, who would leave their home, all their belongings, their extended family, culture, their language, their career? So really to ground ourselves that people seeking protection flee because they have no other viable options. I think about sometimes the networks and relationships that I know many leverage to navigate life, from things as fundamental to how we cope and function when something happens. If you're forced to flee, all of those support networks are disrupted. For problem solving, seeking a new job, all of those things must be reestablished. And I think if I had to flee, because the US was unwilling or unable to protect me or who I am, I would go to a place I would not have language skills. My professional, while here, I have reached a professional status that I'm very secure. That would not be meaningful in another place. I wouldn't have connections. I would need help. I would need advice, and I would need assistance to rebuild my life. So when we think about, before we start talking about the statuses, people who are granted these statuses that we're going to talk about are mothers and daughters, their aunties and grandfathers. They love food, family. They want their kids to succeed like we all do. And they are people of courage and perseverance and resilience, because it takes courage and hope to make the journey to reestablish your life somewhere else. So there's lots of different terms that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about some of the most common legal status pathways to humanitarian protection in U.S. law. And as I mentioned before, while people might have a similar experience about why they had to flee their country, the pathway that they enter the United States, as I mentioned before, determines what type of help they might be eligible for and their rights and responsibilities in the United States. So getting into some of that now. So humanitarian protection in the United States. In immigration law is really complicated, and the pathways are really complex and complicated. In our office, we use the image of an umbrella of humanitarian protection to kind of give a visual of who falls under this category within immigration, U.S. law and statute. What is common about all of the different statuses that you see under that umbrella, be it refugee or asylee or victim of trafficking, safety is central to the definition of humanitarian protection, and that experience of flight and persecution are threads that tie all of these U.S. immigration statuses under that umbrella of humanitarian protection status. And for our office, the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services provides funding that our office uses to administer programs to support people who have these legal statuses in the United States. I was sharing earlier before this started that we're actually holding a conference right now with the providers that we fund, and it's a statewide conference where we have providers from around the state that represent the different communities that fall under this, who provide services that I'll talk about in a minute as well. And in Minnesota, again, to kind of bring it really local here, historically, most of the people who are arriving under the humanitarian protection umbrella were people who arrived with a refugee status. Since 2001, we've seen growing trends of individuals arriving to Minnesota with other statuses, including humanitarian parole, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which parole is not in like the criminal justice sense, but parole meaning in the sense of like a temporary status that has been used in recent years to provide safety to Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion in Ukraine and Afghan after the evacuation of Afghans a couple of years ago. Okay, so I'm going to really focus today on three different statuses, pathways to humanitarian protection in the United States. And I'm focusing on these three because these are the three that are most common for people who are arriving to Minnesota or who are in Minnesota. And they have like variations of what people might be eligible for. And I know as educators and people, you have people in your classrooms who may fit these different statuses, and the status really does make a difference in what they might be eligible for and what their experience is here in Minnesota. So I'm going to start going just in order here, kind of through it. So the first, again, historic, what is very familiar to us in Minnesota is people arriving through the United States Refugee Admissions Program. They call it USREP. And for this program, the admissions program, it is people must meet the definition that they are forced to flee their home and cannot return because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and their home government is either unwilling or unable to protect them. The experience for people who have a refugee experience, it varies from person to person, but I think trends that we've really seen is that lots of people who have arrived to Minnesota with a refugee experience have had to stay in protracted situations for a long time. Um, one example that I share is before working at the state, I worked in resettlement agencies. And I remember in 2025, when the US government prioritized resettlement of Hmong families who were in Thailand, some remaining Hmong families in Thailand, I went to the airport to meet one family, and it was a 3-generation story. It was a grandmother and a mother and a child. And two of those generations had been born in refugee camps. Only the grandmother had ever had a permanent home in a home country. So when we were able to bring them to a home here in Minnesota, that was the first permanent home that two of those generations had ever known. And that story is not unusual. Unusual in that people can stay in protracted situations for quite a long time because the access to permanent resettlement anywhere in the world is so limited while the need is so large. To give you a snapshot of sort of the overall refugee admissions program, again, USRAP, they every year the presidential administration signs what's something that's called the refugee ceiling, or the it's called the presidential determination. And what that does is it sets the maximum number of people who can be admitted with that refugee status in the United States in a year. So you can see that's the blue line there. That number fluctuates over time. Like historically, on average, it's been about 70,000 people. As set as the maximum number. The orange line is the number of people who are actually admitted to the US with a refugee status in any given year. So you can see that that number also fluctuates. If you get to the end there, for the last year, so last year, the Biden administration set a ceiling of 125,000 people. And last year was the highest number in a couple of decades, that just over 100,000 people were admitted to the United States through that program, the most in nearly 2 decades. Next year, the Biden administration has also set a presidential determination, or a maximum number for 125,000 people across the US to be admitted with a refugee status as well. With the change in administration, that number could change, but right now that number is set at 125,000 people. So what does it mean when people are admitted to the US refugee admissions program? Some kind of key factors about the people who arrive with a refugee status. I first want to say, though, that the term refugee is used in a lot of spaces. So there's that international definition of refugee, like the slide that I showed earlier that said, 108 million people who might fit that international definition of refugee. But in US law, there's a specific legal immigration status that's refugee. And so that is like subset within US law. And those are people who arrive with that status. One thing to note is that that status, the processing for that status, the approval as a refugee happens outside of the United States, where people are screened for that program and invited to resettle in the United States. So it's a very intentional process, and a very, I don't want to say predictable, but it's processed through the federal government, and we know about people before they arrive. When people arrive through this program, it is a permanent status. People have a pathway to US citizenship within 5 years, as long as they go through the right steps. People are work authorized upon arrival. Some people are surprised to learn that they are given a promissory note, actually, for the cost of their airfare that must be paid back within 5 years from when they arrive. So people, when they about 2 to 3 months after they arrive, they start getting bills to pay back the cost of their travel. Also, people are eligible for federal benefits, and this is one thing that is not unique to, but is important for this designation of refugee status, is that people are eligible for federal and state benefits like any of us are, if they meet the same eligibility criteria that any of us would need to meet. People complete refugee health screening both overseas and then again once they come here. And it is the federal government who determines what is the where they will be placed upon arrival. Once people are arrived, there's freedom of movement like we all have, right? So we see that people after they arrive in one place may choose to leave and move to other places. In Minnesota, we have a pretty good record of people when they're placed in Minnesota, most people stay here. In addition, we see a lot of people from other states choose to move to Minnesota as well, which we take great pride in because as a mobile population that's seeking a place where they think that they can rebuild their lives and for their family to thrive. Minnesota's got a really good reputation for being a great place for families. And so we see people move here from other states as well. All right. So one thing that is changing right now, so this is kind of a new thing in the last year. So those of you who have worked with people who have arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program for a long time, this is the new thing. So the federal government last year created a new program called Welcome Corps. And this is a private sponsorship program. So people who arrive in the like traditional way that is familiar to us for the last 40 or more years in Minnesota is that people who have arrived have been tied to a local resettlement agency who have helped them for the first 30 to 90 days to help make connections. In this new program, the Welcome Corps, it's a private sponsorship program, which means that private citizens groups of 5 or more people can come together and basically serve the role like a local resettlement affiliate has. This program can work a couple of different ways. People can, those groups, those Welcome Corps private sponsorship groups can come together and be matched by the federal government with a family that they don't know. Or they can name somebody overseas that they know to be able to help them access the program. They would still need to go meet the same definitions of a refugee, still need to go through the same processing. But if they were approved, then they would be matched and join that private sponsorship group here. So this is something, again, in Minnesota, we're really proud of. When this program started, the first families to arrive through the private sponsorship program actually arrived to Minnesota. And we know that there's a lot of Minnesota residents who have stepped up and have submitted applications to become private sponsors moving forward as well. Okay, the second pathway to humanitarian protection that we've seen grow in the last couple of years in Minnesota is this temporary humanitarian protection for certain populations. And so as I mentioned before, the federal government has used this legal status to provide a temporary status and a temporary protection for people in really emergent situations. So this would include the Uniting for Ukraine program, which is again in response to being able to provide safety for Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion. We have seen this used for the Afghan resettlement, and they've also used this program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. The thing that is really not special. The one characteristic of this program is it's not a permanent status. It typically is a 2-year status. Sometimes that has been extended, but the thing that's unique about this is when somebody is granted this temporary humanitarian protection status, there's an end date to it. So it's time limited, typically 2 years with a possibility sometimes of extension. And so we've seen a lot of people come to Minnesota through this program, in particular Ukrainians. So in the past couple of years, this program started in Ukraine in March of 2022. And we've seen probably close to about 3,000 people or so since that time who have arrived with a temporary humanitarian protection status through that program. These programs again, for a temporary humanitarian protection status, these are also initiated by people inside the United States who are essentially inviting people that they know to join them here, saying that they will provide support for people when they get here for that temporary status that they're here. So again, initiated by people who are already here in the United States.
Rachele?
Yes.
We had a question. What is required to be a private sponsor?
Great question. There's going to be a bunch of resources at the end that will go through all of the details, but in general, you have to have 5 or more people. You have to raise a certain amount of money so that you're raising a certain amount of money to be able to support people when they get here, and you have to go through some background checks are the kind of like 3 main criteria. And when we get to the end, there'll be a QR code that will go to our website that goes through the very detailed process, as well as where you can go to apply if you're interested. Thanks for that question. Are there any other questions in there right now?
That was the only one right now.
Okay, great. If somebody has a temporary humanitarian protection status, again, temporary status, it's population based. And people who have this status are eligible for work authorization. And depending on the nationality, the benefit eligibility varies. That's determined by, has been determined by Congress. In general, people with a temporary protective status have not been eligible for federal benefits. However, at the federal level, Congress has allowed Cubans, Haitians, Ukrainians, and Afghans with this status to access federal benefits. Okay, oh, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Again, humanitarian parole, humanitarian protection. So humanitarian parole is different. Some people hear about the temporary protected status. So temporary protected status is also like a parole, a temporary status. And that's for people who are already in the United States from certain countries who the federal government designates as being, if you're from this country, they sort of recognize at a blanket level that it is unsafe for people to return there. So for temporary protected status, it could be people who came here as a student or came here on business. Something happened in their country that made it unsafe for them to go home. They can apply for this temporary protected status, which gives a time limited stay here, but people are work authorized during that time and not eligible for federal benefits. Okay, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on application for asylum. So this is one area of growth that we've seen a lot in Minnesota in the last, I'd say, 12 months. So people who are applying for asylum. So this is, again, people who are needing to flee their home country. The international law and our federal law allows people to present themselves to the federal government and say, I would like to apply for asylum. I am seeking safety. And so people can apply for asylum. So we've seen a lot of an increase of people making appointments or entering at the southern border, presenting themselves to the U.S. Citizenship and the Department of Homeland Security and saying that it's not safe for me to go back home. I would like to apply for asylum. So when people enter the United States, they have 1 year after they enter to, at this point, to present themselves and file an application for asylum. Being granted asylum is to be granted asylum, you must meet the same definition as somebody who is approved for refugee status. The difference of the two is for people who are approved refugee status, that is initiated and happens outside of the United States. For asylees or people granted asylum, it's people who are here and then file that application for asylum. So that processing happens here within the United States. Applications can take a very, very long time. And we know that representation, when people have legal representation, they're more likely to have that asylum claim approved, and legal representation is often very limited. Yes. So what can get confusing in some of this is sometimes people can be here on like a temporary status and apply for asylum. So if somebody is granted asylum, that is a permanent status. There's a pathway to citizenship. And so we see a lot of overlap, and you might see in students that you're working with as well, people who come here on a temporary status and have legal status, work authorization, but they have an end date and are seeking to apply for asylum so that they can stay here permanently. So you can kind of be in a couple of different buckets at the same time as far as status goes. Okay. So for people who are applying for asylum, like I said, we're seeing this number trend up for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because there's been an uptick in the number of people who have gotten a temporary status who want to seek permanency through an asylum application. And then other people who are entering other ways, such as at the southern border, and applying for asylum. So this has probably been the trend that we've seen the uptick the most in the last year. And it can present challenges because that process can be very, very long. And because, as I mentioned before, the legal representation is very limited. We're fortunate in Minnesota. We have more than a lot of states do, but it's still limited for the need that's out there right now. Okay. And I know we just have about 10 minutes or 10 or 15 minutes left. So I'm just going to do a little bit about Minnesota now specifically. As I mentioned earlier, migration, immigration, not new to Minnesota. So we're going to look a little bit at history. So if you know the answer, put it in the chat. If you think you know the answer, A, B, or C, put it in the chat. Which do you think year saw the highest percentage of foreign-born immigrants living in Minnesota? I can't see the chat, so keep putting it in there. You'll get bragging rights if you get it right. The correct answer is 1920. So it's interesting. There's this perception that there's more now than there ever has been, but our immigrant heritage in the state means that the number of foreign-born in the country is now far less than in previous years in our history. So in 1920, 1 in 5 or 20% of the population in Minnesota was foreign-born. And if you look at 2022, that number is 8.7%. The actual high point in Minnesota history was 1870, where it was 36.5 or nearly 36.5% were foreign-born. And if you look at
we have another question.
Sure, go ahead.
With the change in administration next year, will there likely be fewer asylum applications filed, such as the southern border?
So that's a really great question. I think we don't know yet. We have one president at a time. And so I think this administration is staying the course of where they're at, and we'll see what the next administration does. We don't know. I mean, for people who are here in the United States already, we know that people are filing asylum applications and are probably going to want to probably planning on getting those asylum applications in as soon as they can. But many people who file for asylum are entering at the southern border. So what happens at the southern border? How many people, again, the federal government gets to decide who's admitted and who's not admitted. Asylum, you have to be in the United States. So if fewer people are admitted at the southern border, we could see fewer asylum applications. We just don't know what that's going to look like yet. I think lots of people are very curious about what that might mean. So I wish I could tell you, but maybe in 1 year we can do this presentation again and we can talk about trends. Okay. Right. So another question. So what was the most common immigrant ancestry reported by Minnesotans in 2015? Mexican, German, Somali, or Polish? The answer is German. In 2015, over 1.8 million people reported German ancestry. Norwegian was 830,000, Irish 569,000, Somali was 57,000. Okay, last history question here. So Minnesota welcomed about 2,500 people through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program in the last fiscal year. Which proportion of arrivals were children under 18? 35%, 45%, or 75%? Answer is 45%. On an annual basis, the percentage of people who enter through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program hovers around 50%. The last year, that number was about 45%. And more than half are working age adults. So between 18 to 59 years old, there are 53 percent were working age adults. Okay. Normally I would put up like maps that are like charts that show numbers of arrivals, but instead of doing that this time, I'm just going to point you to a really great public resource that's updated on a monthly basis. If you're a data nerd like me, it's always good to go to the source and see what's happening in real time. So this rapsnet.org is a website that's kept up by the federal government. And if you go to this site and you go to this reports tab, it will show you something that looks, well, you'll get a drop down and you can look by state. But if you go to the state demographics or the state list, you'll see a chart that looks like this, where you can see what's going on. So I pulled this yesterday, actually. So between October 1st in 2023 and September 30th, 2024, you can see here that in Minnesota, just under 3,000 people in the last federal fiscal year were placed in Minnesota through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And you can also see by month and what the breakdown is for nationalities. So Minnesota, the people who are coming through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program to Minnesota is very diverse. Over 30 different nationalities last year arrived through this program. Some trends that we're seeing that are different, say, from years before, is that we're seeing more people coming from the Western Hemisphere. Spanish-speaking countries in particular. So for the first time in many years, we're seeing folks from Honduras, from Venezuela, from El Salvador, and other places like that. That is because at the federal level, they're doing more of that refugee process in the Western Hemisphere than they have before. You'll see the largest numbers here for us last year in Minnesota was Somali. This 1,267 individuals were resettled in Minnesota from Somalia last year. Okay, so bringing it down a little bit closer to home again. So what does that mean when people are here? So people are here. I want to share with you a little bit about the resources that are available to people who have any of those humanitarian protection statuses that I had mentioned earlier. First to say our role at the state of Minnesota through the Resettlement Programs Office here is coordinate, we coordinate, we do provide funding. We want to be a good source of reliable information. But one of the things that we don't do is we don't directly resettle people through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. We don't determine who comes to our state. We don't determine when they come to our state. Our role is really about serving the residents of Minnesota. So the federal government determines all of those things, the numbers, the timing, the populations that resettle. And once people are here in our state, we do the best that we can to make sure that they establish well-being, because we know those investments yield to strong communities. So the resources that we get from the federal government allow us to provide services to people during their first 5 years in the country. And our goal is that all newcomers, regardless of the pathway that they come to, can connect to the supports that they need. This is a photo from last year, the conference that we're running right now. This is the photo from last year's conference. So last year we funded more than 40 different organizations around the state to help people connect to services. This year it's even grown a little bit more. So we have more than 50 different service providers funded around the state to help people with some different resources. So we fund what we call resettlement network services. So we partner with agencies that have special expertise in different areas, and then we network them together. And so some of the services that we fund around the state include helping people just navigate like kind of basic need support, helping kids who are struggling in school, helping people secure their first job or improve their economic stability by doing job upgrades. We fund community orientation workshops. We fund immigration services to help people progress on a path to becoming U.S. citizens. And also we fund services to help people navigate healthcare systems.
Rachele, we have just 5 minutes left.
Great, thank you. And so I wanted to share some other resources here. So one of the things that we started this past year, because people are arriving through various pathways, and sometimes we don't know where people are arriving because they're coming to join individual sponsors around the state. We wanted to make sure that people could connect to the resources that are available. So we created the Refugee and Immigrant Helpline. This number, we have staff in our office who answer this phone and can ask questions to kind of figure out what pathway people came on and make sure that they're connected to the supports that are available across our community. The one thing that I'll say about this line is it doesn't matter if somebody has a humanitarian protection status or if they don't. Anybody can call this line and we'll try to connect them to the things that they might be eligible for. This is a QR code I had promised earlier. If you use this QR code or go to our website, you're going to find more information about resettlement in our state. You're also going to find links to where you can get more information about if you wanted to become a sponsor, if you wanted to connect to the private sponsorship program, what the requirements are for that. You can find those things on our website as well. We also created, it's kind of hot off the presses. You'll find links on our website as well. We have a welcome guide for newcomers. I think we have that translated into 10 or more languages right now. Again, really trying to get information out into the community because when most people were coming through resettlement agencies, we kind of knew where people were. With all of these different pathways, we're not sure where people are arriving. We want to make sure that we can get resources to wherever they are. So if you are in schools, if you're working with adults or kids or whoever you're working with, making sure that that you know what these resources are and can point people to them is really, we'll be really grateful to you for that. Also, we in Minnesota had seen more people who were asylum seekers. And so lots of people who are Spanish speaking. And so we worked with the Council of Latino Affairs. They also created a spot on their website, Bienvenidos a Minnesota, there where it's a drop down with some links to in Spanish to other good resources across our state as well. And before I go, because we've just got a couple of minutes left, I don't ever want to end without talking about why this is so important. Again, it's important for the people. It's also important for our state. The pathways to protection are complicated. There's lots of moving parts. There's complicated systems. There's unpredictable waters. A lot of federal changes impact what people's experience here in our state. It determines who enters, who stays, how many people, what their rights and responsibilities are. And in our office, we use a sailboat to kind of think about how we navigate through changing waters of arrival trends and shifting federal laws. The question earlier about, what happens with the next administration, we don't know. And what we try to do in our office is we try to adjust our sails, right, for the changing conditions, all with the goal of positioning them in the best way to help the people who are in our community build well-being and harness the energy that they bring to our nation and to our state that can propel us forward together. And it requires all hands on deck in some cases. But when we do that, when we invest in people, when they get here, we know studies over and over again say that we all benefit when people do well. This report that I'm pulled up right now, this was actually commissioned during the last Trump administration, really to assess what are all of the investments that state and federal governments make in resettling people with a humanitarian protection status. It was released by the Biden administration. Actually, it was completed during the last Trump administration. It was actually released during the Biden administration because it shows really net positive impact. So the positive net fiscal impact of this longitudinal study that they did over 15 years was a positive impact of $123 billion. So that's to say that, again, investing in people on the front end, we all benefit because we know people who are arriving today with a refugee experience are tomorrow's neighbors, workforce, leaders, coworkers, and that we all benefit when they do well. And I know we're at time, but there in the slides, you'll find this as well. New American Economy also did a report with the city of Minneapolis that shows those same trends that they saw on the national level. And it's all people, right? So highlight a couple of people that we're proud of in Minnesota. So Abdurrahim Kahin, he arrived into the U.S. in 1996 seeking asylum. Today, he's an award-winning entrepreneur, restaurateur, philanthropist, and U.S. citizen. And in 2023, he was recognized as National Small Business Association Person of the Year. So he visited the White House again. His story is the story of many people. Some people might know this Minnesotan. So she was a student at St. Cloud State, and she was born in Kenyan refugee camp. She arrived to the United States when she was 7, and she wore the first hijab on a Sports Illustrated magazine. And she's a supermodel, Halima Aden. And there's lots and lots and lots of examples of this. So
Rachele,
again,
it's time to
yes.
end.
Okay.
There's so much information.
I know, and that's why I just want to say, like, it is a pleasure to be able to share this information with you all. And there's just so many examples of why the work that you do to help support newcomers in our communities makes a difference, not just for them, but for all of our communities. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I let them know that you'll upload a PDF of this presentation sometime, hopefully this afternoon, if you have time.
Yep.
And I sent them a link to how they can get to that. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time, Rachele.
Thank you. Take care.